Welcome to The Carpenter's Daughter,
the show where we dig into policy, politics, art, faith, culture, and pretty much everything in between.
Every week we sit down to talk about the issues affecting our world and how it impacts us all.
I'm Ife, writer, author, and perpetual question asker.
And I'm Alexis Comfort, political organizer, artist, and lover of a deep dive.
We bring our experiences, our curiosity, and our commitment to community
to unpack why it matters and how it impacts us all. This is The Carpenter's Daughter. Let's get into it. Oh, we're really getting into it, Effie. All right. Today we have an incredible guest on the podcast.
Super excited.
Amy Spitalnick. We're so happy to have you here, Amy. You were one of the first people we were talking to after we filmed our first or second episode. If we all went to the inauguration of Mayor Mamdani together. And so we're thrilled to have you on here. You're in a lot of high stakes, intense press interviews usually, and this is not different. No, this is.
I'm ready.
Welcome to our living room.
It's a loving, curious space.
Well, no, I'm thrilled to have you here, Amy. So Amy and I met working at City Hall, and I believe you two, it overlapped as well. And so we're all kind of former government gals who are all doing very different things currently. And Amy, you have really emerged as quote unquote a leader of the left in Jewish spaces. I've heard that from many different people. You're on news all the time commenting what's happening. And you're currently the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which we love to hear. Previously served as executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, and the hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence, also known as the situation where people said there were good people on both sides, where Trump said that. But you have tons of experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including as communications director and senior policy advisor to New York AG and spokesperson advisors to New York City Mayor. You serve on the board of directors and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We love it. Tufts University Hillel and the Polarization, Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at American University, as well as Tree of Life's Academic Advisory Council and Bedrock's National Leadership Council, and also loving mom. So we're very, I threw that in there for good measure because literally is Amy's mini me. If he wants to take her out for, she eats like a big girl at the table. She has her whole routine. But Amy, we're thrilled to have you here on the show. And, you know, in a time where there's so much heaviness going on, we're going to mix a little bit of lightness, joy, but also would love to dig into kind of your perspective of what's happening at this moment. So, yeah.
Yeah. And we know that a lot of things may be heavy that come up in this conversation. We like to start off with a segment called How's Your Light? Just to check in on how you're doing now. We may also check out with you as to how your light is on the other side of the conversation. But I do think it's important for us to note, because we have, all three of us have a range of different audiences, that I think the goal in this space is to model like the tough conversations and to model like tough conversations that allow people to like still remain whole and intact while having these hard conversations. A lot of the advocacy that you do raises a lot of, just unfortunately with the polarization that's been happening for quite some time, is has both rightful questions and also questions that are intended to like increase the divide. We are intentional about this conversation. We appreciate the time that you had even before this conversation to just to get a sense as to where we're at. So I want to just ask you at this moment, like, how are you feeling in this moment? I know you recently just had a birthday, so happy birthday. Welcome to the best decade of your life, the 40s.
Yeah.
But just wanted to, you know, see how you're doing at this moment, how you're feeling.
It's like a dark time in the world, and I don't think anyone is suggesting otherwise. And typically, if I'm in a space, it's because like Nazi crap happened and people are asking me to talk about it. And so the silver lining to that is that it has really also allowed me to find the people who do this work, who understand how challenging it is, who want to be sort of addressing it head on. And that is where I find a lot of light and hope right now. I get to work with some of the best people in the world, not just my team at JCPA, but all of our partners in this work across different communities who are sort of like running headfirst into the challenges of the moment and are not shying away from talking about it or working on it. And I get to spend a lot of my time on the road in communities around the country with partners around the country. And putting aside my 3-year-old
Mhm.
and all of the other things happening in my life that really serve as motivation, it's being out there and sort of drawing energy from the people who are in cities and states around the country doing the hard work of trying to right this ship that give me a lot of light and hope right now.
And before we started, a lot of motivation, it sounds like comes from your personal family journey. So if you could just share, where some of that light um, comes from. Your family is no stranger on how to see hope when hope is not necessarily being offered. So if you just want to share some of that familial light, because I thought that was interesting as context.
Yeah, my grandparents on my mom's side are both Holocaust survivors. They grew up in what's now Ukraine, then Poland, which is, kind of horrifying in retrospect to even see what's happening there now, in the same place where they grew up and survived the unthinkable. Their whole families were wiped out. My grandmother quite literally spent the war on the run with her aunt, hiding on top of a stove in a non-Jewish person's house who hid them from the Nazis. She hid underneath a porch as the Nazis killed her sisters and nieces and nephew down the road. She heard the gunshots. And my grandfather survived the war, partially in the Russian army, partially AWOL on the run, and they reconnected at a displaced persons camp and came to America in hopes of creating a better life for their future family. In fact, they worked not very far from where we're sitting right now. My grandmother is a seamstress on the Lower East Side. My grandfather as a New York City taxi driver, among many other jobs. My grandmother was in a union. It provided her opportunity. They had my mom, and my mom became a New York City public school teacher because of the opportunities afforded to her by her parents coming here and looking for a better life. And it was her education, my dad's education, their involvement in the teachers union that I think really created the life that me and my sister were lucky to have. And in turn, created the grounding for me to get to go on and do the work that I do now at a time when it feels really meaningful and hopefully create a better world for my kid and for my nieces and for the rest of my family. Um, but at a time when we're seeing so many of these institutions under threat, refugees and immigrants being attacked, when the fact that my grandparents could come here as refugees is the entire reason my family was able to thrive and succeed here. Our academic institutions being attacked in the name of countering anti-Semitism right now, core civil rights and civil liberties and due process and the rule of law, all of the things that have really protected not just my family, but Jewish families across the history of the United States and more broad, so many others. We're seeing those institutions and those norms and those values under attack. And in some ways, I'm almost grateful that my grandparents aren't here to see it. And at the same time, it really provides the motivation to do this work and to fight to ensure that my daughter and the rest of this next generation can be back in a world where anti-Semitism and hate and extremism more broadly are I don't think we're going to eradicate them, but are pushed back into the shadows where they belong and where we actually have a real inclusive democracy in which they and everyone else is safe, as opposed to seeing our fears and our pain right now really being exploited to undermine that democracy.
That's powerful on so many levels. The first being there are so many marginalized communities that understand like what it means to be in this moment where two things, either their pain is kind of used in political spaces to either other or divide. And I think that that happens a lot when both the plight of individuals who identify, and we talked a little bit about this, whether it's through the religion or the culture as being Jewish, what it means when politically there's kind of a both and, that it feels like sometimes it's used as a way to dismiss other marginalized communities while also the usage of it is a harm to those who exist within that community. And then there's also this overlap around like what it means when there's the culture and then there's also like whether it's this overarching like whiteness that happens at that's like how do we talk about, how do we hold, or I think we're all in the space where we're relearning how we hold anti-Semitism as one of the oppressions that we all should be united around fighting against, which is interesting because as an 80s kid, it was one of those things where you were taught. Like
Yeah,
it
you were
wasn't
taught.
it wasn't like an
Yeah.
exception. It was one of these, in fact, for full disclosure, we were taught it in the contents often as like civil rights struggles and
Mhm.
how various oppressed groups worked together because there were common interests,
That's right.
et cetera, et cetera. A lot of that history is being erased. A lot of that history is intentionally, in many ways, being erased because of the anti-Blackness of it, and therefore other communities are erased. Sometimes the anti-Semitism of it, therefore other communities are being erased. So I do think we're at a struggle to almost like redefine what is our common struggle today,
Yeah, right.
and how do we develop the language today, also recognizing that all of us have evolved into a larger understanding around, due to the conflict in Gaza, as to what this also means in the United States, what this means geopolitically.
Mhm.
And many folks on the quote unquote left are struggling with like, and how do we then engage in like these human rights conversations, these
Mhm.
conversations that unfortunately, but in some ways in an existential way, I think this is the hard work as to like, who are we? How do we, who is the
Yeah.
we? How do we talk about
Yeah.
it? And when we fight, what is the language of our fight? To the extent that we disagree, what is the language of that conversation as well?
Mhm.
Because I think that's part of the issues that we're having. So I'm just rambling on some of the things
No,
that
there's like so much
I
there
know.
that I want to
Yeah.
unpack.
Yeah, like that
Yeah.
I know you, and I say that because I've seen you speak and I respect the work that you do. I respect you as a person, and I respect the fact that like you don't shy away from these conversations, because I think the three of us have a shared interest in like, we are the right ones at this moment to have these uncomfortable conversations.
Right.
And the conversations don't just go away. We had a separate conversation with our loving director where it's like you don't get to just like throw the lid on it, right? Like it's here. Like
Yeah.
it's here. Yes, whatever you want to call these opposing forces are here, but like we're here too. And so what is the moment right now in that clarity? So anyway, that's my ramble, and
Yeah.
we all have
Yeah.
discussed like, excuse me, as somebody who remembers having her first march, you know, in support of like Palestinian lives, maybe in like, I don't know, I was like in undergrad or grad school, um, um, college. It was here in New York City, and it wasn't absent Jewish communities. Like I have to
Right.
like share with people that it wasn't, at least at that time, it wasn't framed as one that, it wasn't a conversation that did not have understanding as to what coexistence looks like, what human
Mhm.
rights looks like. And I have been reminded that I have the luxury of being in a New York City context, that
Yeah.
every space does not have that, right? So I do think that I want to acknowledge the privilege that I have, that I've learned from communities here as to like the ways that these things are complicated, and
Mhm.
also there's space to have that conversation. And I don't expect you to hold all of that, but I am saying that as someone that has like strong circles of individuals that are in the space as to like, what the fuck do we do now when this is
Yeah, what do
also
we do?
politicized?
Yeah, and when conversations, I love how you said conversation many times, you know, how you framed this
Yeah,
episode today. It's like we're at a space where like dialogue is stopping. Like people are just afraid to even get into dialogue to start unpacking this
especially
together.
in person.
And if you can't unpack hardship together, how do you come to solutions? You know? So yeah,
No, there's so much there that I'm excited
Yeah,
to
yeah.
unpack. And I think you talked about the shared history between a lot of marginalized communities, Black, Jewish, and others who came
Mhm.
together around the fight for civil rights in the 60s. That's quite literally the history of JCPA, of the organization I
Mhm.
lead. It was founded in 1944 at a really dark time in Jewish history, when Jews here recognized that the
Mhm.
only way to advance our safety was to build strong cross-community coalitions with other marginalized communities. We co-founded the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights with the
Mhm.
Yeah.
NAACP in 1950, and I get to sit on its board today and do that work. which is incredibly meaningful. My predecessor, Arnie Aronson, literally is right there next to MLK in the photos from the March on Washington and Selma, right? This is the history of my organization that I get to lead now, because Jews have always known that our history is wrapped up in the safety of all communities, and that if any community is unsafe or threatened, we're unsafe, just as the reverse is true. There's no Jewish safety without a truly inclusive, multiracial, multi-faith democracy. And there's no inclusive, multiracial, multi-faith democracy unless all people, including Jews, are really safe. And it's that understanding that's been at the core of not just what JCPA has done for 82 years, but my own understanding of the world, whether it's what we saw in Charlottesville or the work that we're doing now at a really fraught moment, given everything happening in Gaza and the Middle East more broadly. And of course, the polarization and rising hate and extremism and anti-democratic attacks here at home. And so all of that is to say, I think we oftentimes see conversations around anti-Semitism, around the Jewish community, around Israel and Gaza or the Middle East more broadly, flattened into these really binary zero-sum terms that make it that much harder for anyone who cares about both democracy and Jewish safety to feel like both are possible. We're being offered a series of false choices, right? And so to understand what this all means, I think it's helpful to understand how anti-Semitism almost works in a unique way. I think some of it is hating Jews because of who Jews are, what we look like, how we pray or don't pray, what we eat or don't eat. But what's unique about anti-Semitism is that at its core, it's this sort of insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory that's rooted in tropes and lies around Jewish control and power. This idea that there's some sort of shadowy cabal or effort to control our government, our economy, other communities, our electorate, whatever it might be. So in Charlottesville, right, Jews will not replace us. At the time in 2017, it was really confusing for many of us to hear that and not quite understand what they meant. I think now we know exactly what they mean, where there's this increasingly normalized conspiracy theory promoted by everyone from President Trump on down that Jews are seeking to replace the white race with immigrants and refugees, Black and brown people, people who are going to change the electorate, steal the election, change the demographics of our country. Have caravans of migrants coming up from the southern border, supporting Black Lives Matter, whatever it might be. And we oftentimes see how these conspiracy theories don't just fuel a cycle of violence. Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, at Tree of Life, the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in U.S. history, where a synagogue was targeted because it supported immigrants. Chabad in Poway, California, El Paso, where the Latino community was targeted, motivated by these same conspiracy theories. Buffalo, where the Black community was targeted, motivated by the same conspiracy theories. Christchurch, New Zealand, where the Muslim community was targeted. We see how this cycle of violence in which this anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic conspiracy theory that's become so normalized leads to attacks not just on Jews, but a variety of communities. And also now is being used by this administration and others to really justify the most dehumanizing, draconian policies targeting voting rights and immigrants and refugees and so much more. And so it's become so normalized. We're also seeing in this moment, particularly as we see rising anti-Semitic violence related to Israel, but here in the United States, the flip of this. It's not coming from our government, which I think is an important distinction. On the right, we have a federal administration that has normalized these conspiracy theories and emboldened these extremists. On the far left, we have some who are also playing into these conspiracy theories and tropes around Jewish or Zionist control and power related to our foreign policy, related to our economy, related to our politics in a way that has, in certain cases, led to Jews here being, targeted. My own synagogue after October 7th, or ostracized, marginalized, removed from certain spaces, and in the worst cases, led to real anti-Semitic violence, like the shooting outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in D.C. last year, the attack in Boulder, Colorado, the firebombing of Governor Josh Shapiro's home in Pennsylvania. And so we're seeing how all of these conspiracy theories across the ideological spectrum, but in certain cases removed from it, have become normalized in a way that's leading to not just real world violence, but particularly when it comes to the attacks on our democracy, really dehumanizing draconian policies. And we're being offered false choices. On the right, by the Trump administration, that's telling us the only way we're going to keep Jews safe right now is going after our democracy, our fundamental rule of law, civil rights, civil liberties, arresting students, cutting academic research funding, cancer and Alzheimer's research from universities. What this has to do with Jewish safety, I don't know. But we're seeing this false choice being offered, and it's only making Jews and everyone less safe because Jewish safety depends on democracy and on these institutions. And then there are some extreme voices on the other side who are saying that, as a progressive Jew, you can't be proudly Jewish. You can have a connection to a Jewish homeland and still also believe in humanitarian, small d democratic values, Palestinian human rights, or other fundamental progressive values. And so our job in this moment is to reject those false choices and show that actually, like, all of us, if we truly believe in these core progressive values, if we believe in inclusive democracy, can hold multiple truths at the same time. We can believe that anti-Semitism is real and rising, and there is real fear in the Jewish community right now, and that we don't want to see that fear exploited by extreme voices to pit us against other communities, to undermine our democracy or our universities or our rights or anything else in this moment.
Yeah. Hard question number one.
Yeah. We said it's to be a very light episode.
Hard question because I don't know all the things, right? So I'm asking this knowing that I may have, colleagues and friends that know all the answers. But I am asking this also because I do think there is clarity that's needed because terminology is often what people get connected to. So if you are listening, when you mentioned that there is a conspiracy, mostly on the left, around quote unquote, and you did air quotes, Zionism. My understanding and the work that I do is that Zionism, for a loose, like if I was stuck in an elevator and it was 30 seconds, it's almost like a colonized version of, and I already see you shaking your head, but
No.
but I'm just
But
sharing,
these are the
like,
conversations,
these are the conversations that that in many ways it is individuals who are, how's the best way that I describe this? It is the
Maybe I can explain what it actually means to most American Jews, if that's...
Well, I think so. Here, the reason why I think it's important for me to struggle with this is that I'm not sure if even American Jews are the ones that are creating the definition of Zionism that people are running with. In other words,
But we should be, right? It's about our self-determination the same way that any other community
absolutely.
should be, right?
And that's what I think that when you were talking about that and you put that in air quote, I'm like, that's interesting because I also, like, in communities where I feel safe in to ask these questions, I do have, I'm thinking of one Jewish mentor right now, one mentor who happens to be Jewish, who makes it very clear that he is not Zionist. But
that's not where most American Jews are. And I think it's
Okay.
important, right?
Yeah.
So often, like any other community, we see certain voices sort of being tokenized or lifted up as good Jews by certain, and we see this on both the right and the left. Trump loves to talk about the good and bad Jews, the good Jews who voted for him, the bad Jews who don't support him and are disloyal to him or to Israel or whatever. We saw this constantly in the 2024 election and still, right? And it's so dangerous because it basically sets up this idea of good and bad Jews, and the bad Jews are worthy of attack, but increasingly so we also see this idea, right, by particularly on the far left, of saying, well, the good Jews are the anti-Zionist Jews. The good Jews are the ones who don't believe that there should be a Jewish homeland or don't have a connection to the state of Israel or to Jewish homeland. The vast majority of American Jews, 80 to 90% of us, believe in Jewish self-determination in a Jewish homeland. That does not by any means mean that we support the Netanyahu government, the policies of its government, the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, the attacks on Palestinian human rights, dignity, and basic life. But the vast majority of American Jews, and this is ultimately what Zionism really was when it was conceived of in the 1800s, is this idea that Jews are entitled to self-determination somewhere in this place in the world where we have deep historical connections. For me, it goes hand in hand with the belief in Palestinian self-determination. I actually don't think one can exist without the other, because there's about 7 million people on either side of this conflict, and neither side is going anywhere. And so the only path forward is one in which both people have self-determination, humanity, dignity, basic rights, and can live safely and freely without fear of violence or oppression or anything else. And so for me, that's what Zionism is. It's simply the belief in Jewish self-determination. It does not and should not be understood by anyone as support for the Netanyahu government or any other particular government or policy. For me, and I think for so many American Jews, if you look at the poll data, it actually goes hand in hand with belief in Palestinian self-determination and human rights. The most extreme voices on the right are trying to say that Zionism is, or that the state of Israel or the fight against anti-Semitism requires us to not just ignore Palestinian rights, but actually undermine them. And so too do you have some particularly extreme voices on the far left who are suggesting that it's impossible to believe in the right to a Jewish democratic homeland and do so in a way that also recognizes the rights of the Palestinians to their own homeland and to their own dignity and humanity. And it's, again, these false choices, this flattening of where the vast majority of people are. If you look at the poll data of American Jews, of Americans, of Israelis, and so many others, all of us can hold complexity. We can believe that all of these things are possible at the same time, and that our leaders so often try to paint things in binary zero-sum terms because that's how they win. But in fact, the majority of us actually can hold complex thoughts and reject those, and we need our political leaders to recognize that.
Mm. Yeah, that. I will say that term is not probably as fully understood.
Not at all.
Yeah.
There was even a poll that came out of the Jewish community a few weeks ago that said, like, the vast
What is
majority of
Zionism?
Jews don't even know what Zionism means.
And the reason why I think that's important, not to necessarily solve on this conversation, but one for people to think about, is because if the term, right, in its origin has been so, from the way you're saying and the way I'm understanding the definition that I think many people like operate, whether through good intention or not today, um, it is definitely one that is way more aligned with like an extremist white supremacist form um of I wouldn't even say Judaism, because Judaism implies a religion. It could be separate from even the faith component, and more so around more so actually probably connected to the tropes that you were talking about, right? Which are not healthy and helpful. And as you were talking about this, I don't even know if people know, number one, that the origin of it goes back into the 1800s. I think folks think of a much more modern version of it, and that may align with Netanyahu. That may actually coincide with an actual leader. And I also think that there's hasn't I find it today, there's even more so today, but for a while, I think that there's also been a selectiveness as to who gets the mic to talk about these issues, right? So when things are coming from the statesmen in Israel and they are saying it's X, Y, and Z, it's, we're removed from that reality. And I think that sometimes that gets way more attention than the nuanced conversation as to like how you all are holding it is not how we're all holding it. My question today is, if the term is, and I don't think you have to answer it, I think I'm struggling with, if the term is hurting more than it's helping, is this something that is worth correcting, or is it something that's like, hey, it's nuanced and it's nuanced for us, so we're the ones that have to get it right first before others chime in? Like, I guess I'm saying, like, I definitely don't want to use a term that's not helping the situation or hurting more the situation, but it's definitely used a lot, and it's not necessarily.
Well, and I think like we're not even
Talking
speaking
point.
the same language on so many things. So I think we oftentimes see language, or in the Jewish community right now, right? Like there's all of these fights about how do we define anti-Semitism? We have all of these red herrings that are created that actually give an excuse to avoid talking about the real issues at hand. I care less about what people understand Zionism to mean and more about what their actual beliefs are in terms of the humanity and dignity of both Israelis and Palestinians,
Right.
and hopefully their belief that both are
Right.
entitled to live in safety and peace, regardless of their leaders and the failings of their leaders, I should say.
Yeah.
Where the term Zionism in particular becomes relevant to me is when we've seen, particularly since October 7th and the start of the war in Gaza, but also before that, efforts in certain spaces to quote unquote ban or boycott Zionists, right? When you see on a college campus or efforts in like certain literary or artistic or other spaces to say Zionists are not welcome here, when the vast majority of American Jews have this connection to Israel, believe in a Jewish homeland, even if we don't support its government, even if we also believe deeply in Palestinian human rights and dignity, you hear something like that, that effectively means that the vast majority of American Jews aren't welcome in those spaces, whether or not they self-identify as a Zionist, because of the sort of convoluted, messy nature of it. It's really created this marginalization and ostracization of huge parts of the Jewish community, no matter what their actual beliefs are on policy or on the humanitarian situation or anything else for that matter. And so I would love for us to move beyond these terms and actually talk about solutions and what we want to see, not just in the region, but in terms of the safety and rights of people here, when so often, again, we see these terms being used as red herrings to avoid that. We see it being used by our leaders, including our political leaders right now. For example, there was this huge kerfuffle in New York in the first week of the Mamdani administration about him repealing some executive orders related to anti-Semitism and including one of these sort of controversial definitions of anti-Semitism, if you will. The fact that we're arguing about definitions as opposed to what the actual policies are that will keep Jews and all people safe is precisely what keeps us from keeping communities safe.
Yeah.
We should be talking about policies. How are we investing in hate crimes prevention? How are we investing in education? How are we investing in community and public safety? What's in the power of an administration to do, as opposed to, again, these definitional or language fights that oftentimes have nothing to do with where the majority of Jews or Israelis or Palestinians or Americans actually are.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I mean, this is fraught for so many reasons, but I think one thing I would like, and obviously I don't expect you to have the full answer to this, but Iffy and I struggle with like, how do we get people, we talk a lot about third spaces, we were talking about that on the podcast, like in community together, like there's a built-in trust. We've all known each other a bit for a long time. We've broken bread together. There's a level of like trust in even having this conversation that there's not gotcha moments. We're trying to really understand and learn. I guess my question is, where do we go from here, right? Because I find, to your point about kind of the Jewish experience and 80-90% of Jewish people in America feeling this one way, that when politics come into any equation, it often does undermine the spirit of the people. And so, this has been a crisis for our whole lifetimes. It's always talk about peace in the Middle East, and we see it getting exacerbated and worse now. I mean, I think back to my grandfather, who I only got to know till I was 5 before he passed away, was the first head of Lutheran World Relief. And so not only did he do some of that work that you were talking about, we were talking about earlier, where Black and Jewish communities were coming together to, in Jersey proud, desegregate schools in northern Jersey. And, you hear Cory Booker talk about how Jewish lawyers went in so that his parents could go in and get real estate. And they're like, the kind of co-organizing movements. My grandfather used to take a boat and a plane to Palestine and sit down with Palestinians and Christians and Jewish Israelis to like work for solutions. Now we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s, and here we are in 2026, and we feel further from solutions than I've seen in a long time, but also the conversations have just stopped across different sectors, across different ethnic groups, across different communities. And so, like, where do we even go from here to start breaking down these barriers of even having this level conversation with neighbors, with community members, so we can actually start getting to those more positive solutions, even in our own way of approaching anti-Semitism in the United States, let's say?
Yeah. But I mean, like, the only way any of us are gonna be safe is if we actually run headfirst into having these conversations. And the most extreme voices are telling us that we can't sit down together, that it's not possible to stay at the table with people with whom you disagree, especially on issues like Israel and Gaza, but I would argue more broadly in this really polarized moment. And particularly in the Jewish community, we hear this over and over again. The loudest voices saying, "You can't possibly work with, Muslim or Black or other leaders or organizations that have a disagreement with you over Israel or Gaza, or that might talk about it in terms that are different than how you would talk about it, that are using different language or have a different approach." And we're not going to solve anti Semitism by only talking to people with whom we're already 100% aligned, the same way that no community is going to solve the hate they're facing or broader challenges by only talking to people who already understand and agree with it. And
Yeah.
so we need to do a few things. I think one, we need to figure out how to have these conversations. In particular, that's at the core of what a lot of our work at JCPA is, whether it be in civil rights coalitions and interfaith coalitions with other progressive leaders. A year and a half ago or so, AOC and I did a webinar on anti-Semitism. She invited me to come talk to her social media followers and others about anti-Semitism, and you would have thought we were both criminals based on the extreme voices on either end of the spectrum for talking to one another. We actually probably agree on the vast majority of things, although on certain specific policies and language, we definitely have disagreements.
Yeah, you got tons of
Oh,
hate, right, in
ew.
comments and
I mean, her even more than me in certain ways, but the far right of the Jewish community said, "How dare you engage with her? She's anti-Semitic." She's right. And she got attacked by the far left, who basically, in one case, the Democrat DSA chapter unendorsed her, citing her webinar with me. And in other cases, she's had her office graffitied and attacked for supposedly, engaging with quote unquote Zionists. And where does that get any of us? What we need to do is actually have conversations. She and I had a very frank conversation, still online, you can watch it, about what anti Semitism looks like in all of its forms, what its weaponization and exploitation looks like, which particularly ends up targeting women of color like her, especially when they're in leadership roles like she is, what it means to be young women in leadership roles at a time when we are particularly
Mhm.
being targeted. And I'm so grateful for that conversation. But the reason we both got such hate from the extremes was because there's not a lot of conversations like that happening. We need to figure out how to build the muscle to stay at the table and to actually talk about these things, because
Mhm. Yeah.
that's how you break through the binaries that make it so hard. And we're in this feedback loop right now where we're seeing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and broader hate and extremism become so normalized in terms of this administration and others, how these attacks and conspiracy theories don't just make Jews unsafe, but are again being used to justify horrific anti-immigrant and refugee policies, attacks on voting rights, and so much more. And the broader attacks on our democracy and liberties. And then as our democracy erodes,
Mhm.
people are looking for a scapegoat. And so it only allows anti-Semitism to further flourish. And so we're in this feedback loop. And the way we break it is to, again, break the binaries, have those hard conversations, and recognize that most people are coming at this with some level of complexity and nuance and are just looking for the language and the space to actually talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is very hard, I when I used to teach this course at Lehman for a while called African Americans in the Law, I think one of the things that is a struggle, if I can be honest, is that um, there is there is something, and I don't know if there's a word for it, but there is something about I am a member of a community that is we don't use the term conspiracy, but we are literally used. If you want to talk about scapegoat, Black people don't have any. I mean, I have worked in a place where a young sister decided to just advocate for herself, and she asked for a raise and she asked for what she wanted to do. I was off minding my business working on Nelson Mandela's US homegoing experience, and when I came to the office, she was so excited to tell me about how she stood up for herself. And then it hit me as I was eating my watermelon, minding my business. She was like, the supervisor looked at her and said, "Did Iffy put you up to this?"
Oh,
And I remember leaving that. I loved that job. And I remember knowing that I had to leave. And I say that not to personalize, because I do think that there's a lot of individualization that our community, we actually are very much accustomed to collective punishment in a lot of different ways. But I did remember feeling like there really is no way to escape that. There is always going to be this like Black femme trope, whatever it
Yeah.
is, that's going to follow. What I also know, though, is that I am in a society that does not necessarily make that a national priority. So I do think, and I'm going to say the hard thing out loud, is that I do think that the the conversations around this, when you say that there are multiple things that are happening at the same time, is that there is there is there is a color effect, right? Like there is a brownness of Palestinian people, right? Just like there is and to be clear, that is not to say that there aren't brown Jewish
No.
people.
In fact,
Um,
over half of Israelis are Arab, Mizrahi, or Sephardic.
Literally. And also, that doesn't necessarily, this is where I'm saying
it's a
like
breakthrough in the
media,
conversations.
language,
Yeah.
Yep.
all matters, because the images that are
Yep.
shown are not that, right?
Right.
And also, there are there are also human rights issues as it relates to, darker hued, persons of Jewish faith overseas, not even just in Gaza, throughout the world, right? That like there are persecutions that also happen. And it is that conversation of, and definitely not you, because I've had these conversations with you, but of what feels at times like the avoidance of discussing how, like we would probably disagree around language. Like, I would not necessarily call what's happening in Gaza a war, because war also implies like a range of things from like weaponry, access, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that does not mean that I can't have a conversation about conflict. That doesn't mean that I can't have a conversation about targeting. That doesn't mean that I can't have a conversation about terrorism. Like those conversations I can have. And one could even argue that they're one and the same. I think that when to move forward, especially when we are dealing with, if we're going to unfortunately discuss like how unfortunately easy, let's say voter suppression never happened, which we know is always happening, but like to see how there was literally no accountability, in my opinion, to the right, but there was all this like expectation for either a candidate, which at that time was a Black woman candidate, to have all these answers
In 2024.
in 2024 on how to like fix what was like generationally like
Yes.
people have not been able to fix.
And get 3 months to pull it off in what usually takes 2 years of
Yes.
campaigning. Yeah.
Period. And if we're honest, I think the left is going to continue. That's just my prediction. If we don't have these hard conversations, it will continue to repeat itself, because
I agree.
it's going to be, for those that don't know, we are literally having this conversation 5 days after the, Iran,
And like the
and I would
longest
say
5 days ever.
the longest 5 days ever. And I would say, when you're talking about everyone has a drone and a missile that they can just like throw out there, like that war is translating into further misinformation, further like disengagement. We are getting ready for midterms, and I am concerned that we are still yet having, just like we were able to say, it's not necessarily comfortable for me to say certain things like, I don't know what it's like to be in a society where I absolutely believe that anti-Semitism has no place, in the same way that I believe that anti-trans legislation has no place. To me, there is no hierarchy of
Agreed.
right? And yet, if I'm going to be honest, I don't believe that oppression is looked upon equally in our society. And that has real consequences for what I will call the Democratic Party loosely, that has a wide net, that is also looking for space for communities that are harmed, and also have these laws that are conspiring against their lives as well. And so like to also have a space. That is not necessarily the job, though, of Amy. That is not the job
Kind
of
of my job.
It's your job to be in the hard spaces. But I do think that it is the that's what I'm saying is like the conflict of the 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 oppression and also the way that I think it's being marketed to the rest of the world, right? As to like who gets focused, how we focus. And nobody wants to really say it like that. And I may be saying it even in a like
No,
fudgy
like the
way,
oppression
but
Olympics,
I
right?
think that's the only reason why I don't like the term oppression Olympics. This is my only caveat. And as somebody who like trains different organizations and what have you, as somebody who is multi-intersectionally oppressed and marginalized, I do not believe that me bringing up the ways that I have to struggle through society is a one-up on somebody else.
No, I agree.
Right? Specifically as a Black femme disabled person, I know that individually and collectively, those are things that our society chooses to run away from. That we can talk about women's rights all days and not give a fuck about like Black women dying in hospitals in the United States. That is not an Olympics. I also know that a lot of times part of the beauty of the civil rights movement is that many people marched and fought and died in the hopes and the pursuit of gaining rights, and also had also knew they were fighting on behalf of other people.
Yeah.
Right? Like the women's suffrage movement was a gamble for Black women to be a part of designing those strategies, to also then be told during the women's suffrage movement, y'all need to go march in the back. Like that is also part of the history. So for me, I think that there is, yes, like this larger Olympics, this larger, like, who, I don't want to say who gets airtime, but there's also, I find oftentimes an inability, and we've talked about this even in faith spaces, the inability to talk about like the extremeness of what it means for Black and brown communities that oftentimes put faith to the side, like just oftentimes are not prioritized as far as safety.
Yeah.
And I think that that is the tension
I think that's
that
a lot of the
makes
tension we see.
anti-Semitism not the thing that anybody would say, nah, we should go 100% and just be, I don't even know what the reverse of
Philo-Semitism, which can actually also be anti-Semitic.
What is that?
It's like the reverse of anti-Semitism.
What is it called?
Philo-Semitism,
What does that
which is
mean?
oftentimes used by particularly far-right, evangelical, and other voices to purportedly express support for the Jewish community, but oftentimes then manifest in support for
That's
like,
that Judeo-Christian,
Jews come
yes,
in,
that we come in
Jews
as
returning to the land of Israel in
Oh,
hopes
God.
of
That's
bringing on,
corrupt.
exactly. And so
Wow.
there's a lot to unpack there, and the ways in
Say a lot
which
of white
the line between
Christian people
philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism is real in some of these particularly far-right Christian spaces is like a whole other podcast, probably.
Well, and the fact that I also find, real talk, this current administration in the United States
Exactly.
doesn't care about any of us. So it's like the fact that we act like
Absolutely.
they're protecting Jewish people.
No, they're not protecting
they're
I
Jewish
thought
people.
Trump was a known I must have grown up differently. I thought he was a known.
It was known. It's willful dissonance.
Okay.
And also, like, if this administration cared about Jewish safety as they claim, they wouldn't be appointing avowed neo-Nazis to senior roles in the federal government. They wouldn't be expressing and normalizing the very same conspiracy theories that had led to the mass murder of Jews and others. They wouldn't be gutting funding for the hate crimes prevention and the Office of Civil Rights and Title VI, which protects Jewish and all students on campuses.
But
right?
that's
They're
what makes
literally
people
destroying the infrastructure that keeps Jews at all communities safe.
And that's what makes people, if we're going to be honest, the optics are weird. If you don't know enough about like Bibi Netanyahu, then the optics are weird as to like, so how are y'all buddies knowing this history?
And that's what, like, I mean, this whole section has been like flipping the tables for us because it feels infuriating because it feels like
everyone's getting played.
Yeah, it feels like we're all getting played.
We're all being played.
And I'm looking at these last 5 days. I'm like, yeah, this is going to make us safer. Like, hold on to. You can say there's a terrible regime in Iran. We can agree on that and liberation for all people. But then, how is this not going to create particularly incredible tragedy the way we're doing this for your daughter's generation? Like, I'm just like, are we doing any future thinking? Are we caring about the young people and our consequences?
No, again, multiple things can be true here, right?
Yeah.
Like the Iranian regime can be repressive and awful and anti-Semitic and bigoted and a threat to our values and our security in Israel and all of the things that are true. objectively, I would argue. And this administration has, of course, moved forward in a way that appears to not involve any international support, have no
Any
goals or plans for this
any
war,
deliverables.
have no exactly, or the constitutionally required authority to go to war.
But this is
And all of this makes us less safe, particularly as you have Republican leaders claiming that this is Israel's war or other rhetoric that is only going to boomerang back on Jews here in the United States.
So would you consider Bibi anti-Semitic? Because I would.
I would.
Based
I don't
on
think
that
we should be
definition?
labeling other Jews anti-Semitic. I think we can
Okay.
argue that the actions of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his administration have been fully at odds with Jewish values and safety in a variety of ways, right? And it's not just the ways in which his anti-democratic policies within Israel are dangerous. It's not just the ways in which his policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians are horrific and heinous in every way, shape, or form. Like, we're literally right now seeing the Netanyahu administration try to change the policy at the Western Wall, which is the holiest place in Jewish tradition, to basically ban egalitarian and other forms of reform or conservative prayer, right? So I grew up a conservative Jew, which is not politically conservative, but not Orthodox, not Reform. I now go to a Reform synagogue. All of the ways in which I learned to pray growing up are being hypothetically banned by the Netanyahu government at the Western Wall. And he has,
what kind of prayer does he want?
Because he is much like the administration in the United States.
Yeah, it's feeling
seeking
very
to advance. We'll do a few
parallel.
things. I think first and foremost, he is under indictment there and facing his own legal challenges, which again feels very, very familiar to us in the United States. And two, he's really pandering to the far right of the Israeli political system and Israeli society for his own political self-interest in a way that is fundamentally at odds with where a number of Israelis are, and certainly where the diaspora of the Jewish community who look to Israel as a place that should be welcoming to us, right? The Jewish homeland should be a place where all Jews are able to go and pray the way that we pray, the holiest site. And so it is, in so many ways, the parallels between how Netanyahu and Trump use fear and division and attacks on democracy and pluralism to protect their political self-interest is real, and it's dangerous, and neither makes Jews safer. Both make Jews and so many other communities less safe. And the core of Jewish tradition, the core of Jewish values is to call that out when our safety is being exploited to advance someone's political interests. But right now we have certain leaders in the Jewish community and others who are afraid to call that out, who are afraid to say that the Trump administration or the Netanyahu government are actually undermining Jewish safety and values. But I think we're all obligated to, because again, like, if we continue down this path, we're not going to have Jewish safety here. We're not going to have an Israel or a Jewish homeland, and we're not going to have any other sort of safety for any other community if we allow either administration to continue down these paths.
We've talked a lot about the hypocrisy of the way people are weaponizing faith for their own political gain. I've said before, I'll say it again, you can't be a follower of Christ and a follower of Trump. They're competing ideologies. You know what I mean? And just because one brandishes themselves in their religion to get at their political gain does not mean we believe that they're espousing those values in their way that they actually lead the people. You would hope that those core values, that there actually is a lot of shared values between Christianity and Judaism about helping the poor and giving back to your community. And we're seeing leaders rise up that are using this to actually further oppress people. And I think that is the thing that's really hard to get your head around when you see people continue to follow efforts that are very geopolitical, when the leaders who are wielding huge swaths of power are in a lot of ways endangering their own people.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, look, like October 7th, right? The deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, the Hamas attack of October. There were efforts to block an inquiry into how it happened. But Netanyahu was so wrapped up in his own political self-interest that Israel's own security allowed for a massive terror attack to happen, where particularly communities on the southern border that had been doing coexistence and peace work were attacked because of some of the failures of the IDF and the Netanyahu government, of course, on top of the fact that this was a horrific terror attack. And so if you think about all of this, Jews, Israelis, none of us are more safe because of these policies. We're actually far less safe than we were even a few years ago because of how faith and fear and division are being exploited by these leaders to advance their political self-interest.
So, I mean, as Alexis mentioned, we I guess as we are thinking about what then we know we need to have more conversations, definitely need to have more like facilitated conversations because I don't think that you know, in this particular area, and I want to add that it's not just Judaism and Christianity, right? That um have in
Yeah.
their
Yeah, of
tenets,
course. Yeah, yeah.
like making sure that like the oppressed and making sure that communities are taken care of. I'm also I'm almost concerned that the ways that I'm almost concerned that traditional religion is not helping anyone, but that's a whole
Mhm.
separate conversation that I think there's needs to be a different, much more soul-led and spirit-led way of how we, espouse whatever it is that we believe our higher being is calling for, while also not shying away from the ways that the traditional religion has also deepened oppression, right? I think
And
that
harmed people,
sometimes
yeah.
that is the frustration, even with the Gaza conflict. I think we all before we started here, I shared that I have a really good friend of mine, amazing storyteller whose mother is still alive and like survived the Nakba. So when we're talking about like homeland, I know that that's a very hard conversation for her to have because she is not an imagination. Like she was here, she is here and she was here to see a country that at one time was like part of the nation that she was a part of, and now she is so unsafe, like she does not live there. And so I always think about like, is there room for her? Like, is there room for her to be
Mhm.
at the space, very similar to the ways that our histories in this country of both unifying and movement, but also history specifically of Black Americans are being erased as if there aren't people dying today that were like weren't sharecroppers. Like this is not ancient history.
It's
This
not
is
ancient. Yeah.
people are
People are
here and
alive.
people are alive. There are 100-year-old, you know, African Americans, which means that there are individuals that actually lived through post slavery and beyond. And so I put that just all in context as to, I am saddened by the fact that a lot of these leaders would rather all of us just like die off and so that they could recreate their own version of, history. The only way that gets challenged is if like those of us with even historical differences are able to come together
Yeah.
and say like how do we again define, and I am actually one of those people that believes that words do matter.
Same.
I w- I'm connected to a people that it was literally words that made them chattel. And it's one thing to it's not one or the other. There's a level of dehumanization that I don't think America has ever really understood, to know that a human being was literally just as valuable as this table, if not worse, and definitely if compared to animal, probably less than. And so when we when these conflicts add up, I do think that it's important to state that it's compounding, it's not a
Mhm.
new, it's adding
Mhm.
on top of. And to the extent that there is space for people to be able to share truths, traumas, hurts. That has to be a part of the process. Unfortunately, what ends up happening and all of our communities suffer is that many folks at least feel, if they're not told explicitly, put that to the side.
Yeah.
And that's not helping. I know for a fact that's not helping. And that is not just as it relates to Gaza or Iran or what have you. That's We're going to have to do something radically different with our conversation and our discourse. And I wish we could. I mean, not only do I believe that you are at the forefront of that knowing your leadership in a lot of these mixed, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious spaces. But even when I think of like my nephews, your daughter, like when I think of what's the language that is surrounding them,
Yeah.
I am concerned about the narratives
Yeah.
not being clear enough for young people to be like, how do we pick up our own
They
mantle
don't know.
in
Yeah.
this baton and in this world? I am concerned about that next generation. Maybe the generation after, I'll be like, okay, maybe some things will fall apart. But I am actually concerned about that. So I did want, as we're wrapping, you to share like what are the takeaways that you think about for your daughter, for like children? Like when you look at her, and not just her, but other children, what is it that you were either hopeful for? What is it that you want to instill in her? And in youth more broadly, like what is that takeaway, you know?
Like, I think it's sort of what we were talking about before, which is that our safety is interconnected and you can't separate out the fight against
Absolutely.
any form of hate from the broader fight against oppression. And so at a time when the most extreme voices are trying to pit communities against one another, trying to suggest that there's only so much pie to go around and we can only either fight
Right.
anti-Semitism or fight racism or fight for LGBTQ rights or any of these other things, we need to understand that these struggles are deeply interconnected, the
That's
ways
right.
in which anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are deeply connected to racist and xenophobic conspiracies. We see how they fuel attacks against so many communities and vice versa, right? When voting rights, when the Black community is under attack, it makes Jews less safe, not just because there are Jews of color and others, but because it undermines our democracy and all of us are less safe. And so whether it's my daughter or anyone else, I hope that they are able to grow up in a world where there's more understanding that these aren't distinct issues, but rather inextricably linked. And the only way in which any of us are going to be safe is if all of us are safe. And that means, again, rejecting those extreme polarizing voices who try to offer us these false choices to suggest that it's either or, that it's Jewish safety or democracy, that it's fighting anti-Semitism or fighting racism, and actually recognize that the only way we fight if we fight for any of these rights and safeties, to fight for all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, and who are the people, we always ask, who are the carpenters? Who are the people that you see doing great work? I mean, obviously, I echo what If you said. I think you have run into some of the boldest, hardest fights, and maybe it's personal too. But like from Charlottesville, I mean, I can't think of a scarier job than taking on Nazis directly. You've been a brave carpenter that I've noticed in my life. Who are the people who inspire you? Who are the people that fuel you to keep on doing the work you're doing?
I think in many ways it's the people who also run headfirst into these fights and these conversations. Like, and not everyone needs to go sue a Nazi or,
Yeah.
you know, testify before Congress or do any of the things that, you know, that you might feel like you need to do. It's simply just being willing to have these conversations and engage with like an open heart and open ears and an open mind. And I think particularly in my work and my life, I'm really lucky to have a number of people like that. I think of people like Maya Wiley, who leads the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. I'm on her board. And in the aftermath of October 7th and what was happening in Gaza, it was the work not just publicly with her, but behind the scenes that really worked to keep our coalition together, to bring together the Jewish and Muslim and Arab and other groups within the Leadership Conference to say, we're not going to let this moment divide us.
Yeah, Maya's incredible.
And that mattered. That mattered to me as a Jewish woman who was feeling really hurt and isolated in the aftermath. And it mattered, I think, to the majority of us in the coalition who were just hoping that this moment wouldn't further undermine our fight for democracy and civil rights at a time when it feels existential. Similarly, I think about, just the other day, I did an event with Reverend Malcolm Bird from Harlem, from National Action Network, and we just had this like really frank public conversation about a lot of the issues that we were talking about here. We spoke at the J Street conference in DC alongside Maya and Rabbi Saperstein, who's been sort of a hero of the civil rights movement in Jewish spaces. And it was just so meaningful to have this conversation and not shy away from the elephants in the room, to talk about the challenges, but to say that we're not going to let it fracture our communities or our solidarity, people like Salam al-Mariyati, who runs the Muslim Public Affairs Council, which has been one of our closest partners in recent months. We did a big solidarity event on Capitol Hill in the aftermath of the Bondi Beach Hanukkah shooting that killed a number of Jews, and the sort of subsequent really horrific Islamophobic statements we heard from members of Congress blaming the Muslim community for that attack. And he has just been someone who I don't agree with on everything, but has been there at the table with us, saying we're not going to let this moment, we're not going to let potential disagreements fracture our coalitions and prevent us from working together for our shared safety. And those people don't just give me hope in this moment when it really feels like there's not a lot of hope, but they're the way we're actually going to move forward here. Like if we can't figure out how to have those conversations and to, most importantly, keep our coalitions and our communities together, building that towards that shared solidarity and safety, I don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, and thank you for raising that anti-Muslim rhetoric. I try to pass C-SPAN and all these spaces nowadays, but since this war broke out in Iran, I am hearing things that mirror what it was like to be like in this area post 9/11. I am nervous about that. Every time I hear them intentionally say Barack Hussein Obama, I also know that there are ways that for a lot of everyday people, when they hear Islamophobia, images of Black and brown individuals are what pops up. And that, to your point of all these interconnected conflicts and oppressions, cause a form of an ongoing form of like insecurity when it comes to safety, physical safety, and targeting. My hope is that as we are trying to figure out what it is that we are trying to define, what it is we're fighting for, where we have differences, but it doesn't get us distracted on where we need to fight together, that we also make sure that we are fighting for the other, right? And I think you have raised that, like that there are spaces where attacks on us ain't cool, but attacks on them ain't cool either.
Yeah.
And I think we need to keep modeling that, because young people are really being siloed into these lanes of individualism that isn't able to understand intersectionality in the ways that are healthy and helpful and that a lot of our ancestors understood.
And it takes nothing away from the fight against anti-Semitism to fight Islamophobia or fight racism. In fact, we can't fight anti-Semitism without also fighting
I don't
those other
think
forms
so.
of.
But I do think that our messaging publicly is not doing a good job.
It's not it. Not it.
It's not
It is not. Whatever we are doing is not it,
It's not
because
it.
all of these forms of hate are only increasing. Our communities are more divided and polarized. And we have to look at the policies and the leadership that got us here and be willing to name what hasn't worked and what's failed us.
Yeah, and if anyone tries to replicate this at their home, good luck. But I will say, I mean, I'm acknowledging like it's three of us who represent a lot of different groups, and there's also a lot of other groups that are not in this space to have this conversation. And I would love for us, even if it's not on camera, to engage with you and others, those that are Palestinian, those that are Muslim from other regions, those who are Jewish from other regions, to like have this conversation out, because all of the different perspectives, I think, help us get unified on the whole. And to your point, and we're not afraid to have the conversation. I think it's been taught that you can't have this conversation except for when you're, trying to be a soldier and be all huff and puff on Twitter and Threads. Seriously.
Yeah, like really easy to hide behind your screen.
It's easier to hide behind the screen. And we're asking questions that I'm like, when was the last time I actually just asked the question and there was a response? It's possible. So with that, I'm just deeply, deeply, deeply humbled by at least my curiosity and my questions. And I'm just grateful to like have part one of this conversation. Yes, there will be a part two. So thank you so much, Amy. And thank you for the way you advocate on behalf of all of our communities.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's our show for today. Thank you for spending time with us and for being a part of our community.
As always, keep asking questions, keep talking, and keep showing up with intention.
We'll be back next week with more conversation, curiosity, and commitment to our community.
Until then, stay grounded, stay hopeful.
See you next time
on The Carpenter's Daughter.